The bottom of the Chesapeake Bay is a flat, suffocating blanket of mud. Anything living down there that can't outgrow it simply disappears. And the one organism that could outgrow it, the one species that built the bay's floor, cleaned its water, and held the whole system together, is 99.7% gone. By 2011, the oyster population had dropped to 0.3% of what it was in the 1800s. Not 3%, 0.3%. And with them went everything they held together: the water clarity, the oxygen, the grass beds, the crabs, the fish, the jobs, the towns. The whole system collapsed because one organism vanished from the bottom, and nobody fully understood how much weight it had been carrying until it was gone. The fix, when it finally came, it targeted the exact physical failure point that had kept the bay locked in collapse for over a century. But to understand why dumping billions of oysters onto granite boulders actually worked, why that specific combination of geometry and biology reversed a 100-year death spiral, you have to understand how the machine broke in the first place. Because the Chesapeake Bay didn't die from pollution. It didn't die from neglect. It died because someone flattened it. When the system worked, it was one of the most elegant biological engines on the planet. The Chesapeake Bay has 14 square miles of land draining into every square mile of water, the highest ratio of any coastal body on Earth. Rivers, streams, farm ditches, city gutters, 6 states' worth of runoff, pouring soil and nutrients into one shallow estuary every single day. And for 6,000 years, the bay handled all of it, because the oysters were running the filtration system. Here's how it worked mechanically. Oysters are living water pumps. Each adult animal draws water across its gills, strips out particles, algae, sediment, organic matter, and either digests them or packages them into dense pellets that drop to the bottom. One oyster can filter 50 gallons of water a day. At their historical peak, before 1870, the oyster population was so dense that the entire collective could filter the bay's full volume, all 18 trillion gallons, in roughly 3 to 4 days. The whole bay run through the gills of oysters every single week. But the filtration was only part of the engineering. The oysters didn't just clean the water, they built the floor. Like each generation cements its shells onto the shells of the generation before it. Layer after layer, year after year, century after century, the reefs grew upward. They weren't flat. They were towers and walls, rising from the mud into the water column, sometimes breaking the surface at low tide, sometimes tall enough to rip the hull off a ship. In 1701, a Swiss traveler wrote that the abundance of oysters was incredible, that there were whole banks of them so thick that ships had to steer around them or risk running aground. His own boat struck a reef and sat stuck for 2 hours, waiting for the tide to lift it free. That vertical height wasn't just impressive, it was the entire point. The oysters needed to grow upward because the mud was always rising. Sediment settles, that's what it does. And in a bay with 14 square miles of land draining into every square mile of water, the sediment never stops. So the oysters evolved to build faster than the mud could bury them. They cemented themselves into rigid, 3-dimensional structures that punched up through the silt layer and into the clean, oxygenated, fast-moving water above. The height kept them alive. The jagged edges of the reef created tiny currents and turbulence that swept settling particles away. The reef was self-cleaning, it was self-building. It was an architecture designed over millennia specifically to defeat the one thing that could kill it: burial. And then, over the course of a few decades, the dredges leveled every inch of it. After the Civil War, the oyster harvest industrialized almost overnight. In canning technology and railroad expansion turned Chesapeake oysters into a national commodity, and the demand was ferocious. By 1884, watermen in Maryland alone pulled 15 million bushels out of the bay in a single season. Billions of individual animals, hauled up by heavy steel dredges, dragged across the bottom by motorized boats. The dredge is where the cascade starts. Picture a steel frame with iron teeth and a chain link bag, weighing hundreds of pounds, towed at speed across the reef. It doesn't just harvest oysters, it demolishes architecture. Every pass of the dredge sheared off the top of the reef, the living, growing surface, and scattered the shells and rubble across the mud. The dredge took the oysters, yes, but more importantly, it took the height. And without the height, the first domino fell. The sediment that the reefs had been outrunning for 6,000 years suddenly had no obstacle. The flattened reefs, leveled to the same plane as the surrounding mud, were sitting right in the slowest, deadest water. The boundary layer, right at the bottom, where current speed drops to almost nothing, and suspended particles simply fall out of the water and land. Millimeters of silt accumulated on the broken shell, then centimeters. The remaining hard surfaces, ones that baby oysters needed to attach to, disappeared under a blanket of soft, suffocating mud. That's when the reproductive cycle broke. Oyster larvae are microscopic, free-floating animals that drift in the water for about 2 weeks before they need to find a hard, clean surface to land on. No hard surface, no attachment. No attachment, no new oyster. The burial of the shell didn't just kill existing oysters, it severed the reproductive cycle entirely. Billions of larvae drifted through the water column, found nothing but mud, and died. New animals successfully joining the population dropped towards zero, and that failure opened the next one. Fewer oysters meant less filtration. Less filtration meant the water stayed cloudy, loaded with algae and sediment that nobody was pumping out anymore. At their peak, the oysters filtered the entire bay every 3 to 4 days. By the time the population crashed, that same job took a full year. Nutrient-rich runoff from farms and cities that the oysters used to strip out in hours now sat in the water column for months. The excess nutrients fed enormous blooms of algae. When the algae died and sank, one bacteria consumed the dead cells and burned through the dissolved oxygen in the process. The oxygen levels plummeted below 2 milligrams per liter, the threshold where almost nothing can survive, creating massive dead zones that spread across the bay floor every summer. The cloudy, algae-choked water also blocked sunlight from reaching the bottom. Underwater grasses, eelgrass, widgeon grass, need light the way any plant does. Without it, they died back, and those grasses had been anchoring the bottom sediment with their root systems. When the grasses vanished, the sediment that their roots had been holding in place was released back into the water, making the cloudiness worse, which killed more grass, which released more sediment. A perfect feedback loop, spinning faster with every cycle. And then the diseases arrived. In 1949 and 1959, 2 parasitic infections entered the bay. One that targeted adults, one that hit juveniles. Under normal conditions, a healthy, dense population of oysters can evolve resistance over a few generations. The strongest survive, they breed, and their offspring inherit the toughness. But this population wasn't dense, it wasn't healthy. It was flattened, buried, oxygen-starved, and scattered into fragments too far apart to breed their way out. The diseases ripped through what was left, and the surviving animals had neither the numbers nor the genetic diversity to fight back. The system was trapped, flat reefs got buried. Buried reefs couldn't recruit. Low recruitment meant weak filtration. Weak filtration meant cloudy water. Cloudy water killed the grasses. Dead grasses released more sediment, while more sediment buried whatever was left, and the diseases kept the population too low to break the cycle. Every year the system stayed in this state, recovery got harder. The bay wasn't slowly dying, it was actively maintaining its own death. A machine running in reverse, each failure reinforcing the next. By 2003, the commercial harvest had dropped to 50,000 bushels. In 1884, the number was 15 million. The oystering towns, Crisfield, Oxford, communities that had built their entire economies on the shell, hollowed out. 25,000 people had worked the harvest at the peak. By the 2000s, there was almost no one left. The bay had lost its filter, its floor, its grasses, its oxygen, and its economy, all because one structural variable had been removed: height. For decades, white people tried to fix this the obvious way. State agencies dredged up ancient fossil shells from deep in the bay and dumped them onto the depleted bottom. They bought fresh shells from shucking houses and spread them across the mud in thin, flat layers. In some years, Maryland planted 2 to 5 million bushels of shell, spending $1 to $2 million annually, hoping wild larvae would settle on the clean surfaces and rebuild the reefs naturally. It didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is the same reason the reefs collapsed in the first place: geometry. A thin layer of shell sitting flat on a mud bottom is a target. It's sitting in the slowest water, right where the sediment falls. Within a season, sometimes within weeks, the mud covered it. The larvae couldn't find it. The cycle continued. Worse, the areas where the state planted those shells were still open to commercial dredging. So even on the rare occasions when oysters did manage to settle and start growing, the dredges came through and tore them off before they could build any height. The state was essentially filling a hole while someone else kept digging it out. Millions of dollars spent. The trajectory of the bay didn't change at all. By the early 2000s, the shell supply itself was running out. The fossil deposits were exhausted. The shucking houses didn't have enough product. The entire approach was bankrupt, financially and physically. And it failed because it was fighting the symptom. The symptom was a lack of oysters. The cause was a lack of three-dimensional structure tall enough to stay above the mud. In 2014, a coalition of federal, state, and nonprofit organizations signed the Chesapeake Bay Watershed Agreement and committed to something that had never been attempted at this scale: rebuilding the actual floor of the estuary from scratch, not with shells, with stone. The plan was called the 10 Tributaries Initiative, 5 rivers in Maryland, 5 in Virginia, and the goal was to permanently restore the oyster habitat in each one by 2025. The key word is permanently. These weren't going to be harvest grounds. They were going to be sanctuaries. No dredges, no tonging, no extraction of any kind, ever. The Army Corps of Engineers mapped the river bottoms with sonar, identifying the firmest ground with the best water flow and salinity. Then they brought in barges, massive industrial barges, loaded with quarried granite, crushed concrete, and fossilized shell. One in the Piankatank River alone, building just 25 acres of reef, required over 29,000 tons of granite loaded onto 9.5 barges. The stone was lowered onto the river bottom and arranged into reef bases that rose 8 to 15 inches above the mud. 8 to 15 inches, that's the whole fix. At that height, the stone sits in moving water, not the dead layer at the very bottom. The jagged granite surfaces create turbulence that deflects settling sediment the way a rock in a stream deflects leaves. The mud can't land. The surface stays clean, and a clean, hard surface in oxygenated moving water is exactly what an oyster larva needs to survive. Meanwhile, at the Horn Point Hatchery on Maryland's eastern shore, scientists were breeding oysters specifically selected for their ability to survive the 2 diseases that had been wiping out the wild population for 50 years. They took the toughest adults they could find, the ones that had survived infection in the most hostile, high-salinity waters, and bred them in controlled tanks. The larvae were set onto cleaned, recycled shells, where they attached and hardened in place within 48 hours. Spat on shell, the industry calls it, living oysters pre-attached to a surface, ready to be deployed. The Oyster Recovery Partnership loaded those spat-covered shells onto shallow draft boats, navigated to GPS coordinates that matched the sonar maps exactly, and blasted the living shells onto the granite bases using high-pressure water hoses. They were painting the stone with biology. Billions of disease-resistant animals placed directly onto sediment-proof foundations inside waters where no dredge would ever be allowed to touch them. Harris Creek, a tributary on Maryland's eastern shore, became the flagship site. Before restoration, it had 2 acres of functioning reef left out of a historical 1,500. The team built 348 acres of new reef and planted 2.49 billion oysters onto them. The total cost for Harris Creek alone was $29.06 million. Then they waited. The monitoring protocol required 3-year and 6-year check-ins. There was no rushing it. The oysters had to survive disease seasons, survive winter, survive the massive freshwater floods of 2018 that dropped the salinity and stressed every living thing in the tributaries. The stone held, the oysters held, and in 2021, the 6-year data came back. 343 out of 348 acres passed. 98.6% of the restored reef met every benchmark for density, biomass, and the presence of multiple age classes. Meaning, the oysters weren't just surviving, they were breeding. New generations were settling on the old ones, building height, cementing together, doing exactly what their ancestors had done for 6,000 years before someone dragged a dredge across them. Harris Creek was declared the first fully restored tributary in the Chesapeake Bay. And then the cascade that had been running in reverse for a century started running forward. The filtration came back first. The reef density in Harris Creek hit levels where the oyster population could filter the entire water volume of the creek in under 10 days during summer. In Virginia's Lynnhaven River, where the high salinity water let the oysters grow even faster, monitoring teams recorded 3,400 adults per square meter, a density so thick the reef surface was essentially solid shell. Water that had been opaque for decades started clearing. The clear water let sunlight reach the bottom again. And the grasses came back. In 2018, aerial surveys recorded 108,000 acres of underwater grasses across the Chesapeake Bay, the highest number in the modern record and nearly triple the historic low of 38,000 acres measured in the mid-1980s. The same feedback loop that had killed them was now feeding them. Clearer water meant more grass meant more roots anchoring sediment, less suspended sediment meant even clearer water. The loop was running the right direction. The oysters were also pulling nitrogen out of the system, not just by filtering it, but by processing it. The animals trap nitrogen in their shells and tissues, and the dense microbial communities living in the reef structure convert dissolved nitrogen into harmless gas that escapes into the atmosphere. Harris Creek's reefs alone remove an estimated 20,000 pounds of nitrogen every year. Over a decade, the projection is 1 million pounds, the equivalent of pulling 20,000 bags of garden fertilizer out of the water and making them vanish. And in the summer of 2023, NERM, the dead zone that had haunted the Chesapeake Bay for decades, shrank to its smallest recorded size since monitoring began in 1985. Just over half a cubic mile. The long-term average had been nearly a full cubic mile. The water was holding oxygen again. The stone architecture itself became a city. Researchers documented over 50 species colonizing the Harris Creek reefs: hooked mussels, barnacles, anemones, sea squirts, more than 5,000 individual organisms per square meter on the densest structures, not counting the oysters themselves. Juvenile blue crabs, the species that drives the bay's most iconic commercial fishery, showed a 300% higher survival rate on the restored three-dimensional reefs compared to the flat, bare mud they'd been stuck with for a century. The crabs finally had somewhere to hide from predators, and the population responded immediately. Even though the sanctuary reefs themselves are permanently closed to harvest, the spillover, larvae drifting out of the sanctuaries into open waters, crabs migrating into harvestable zones, has driven commercial oyster harvests in Maryland to triple over the past 2 decades. Economic models project that the mature reefs in the Choptank River system alone will generate $23 million annually and support over 300 jobs. The $29 million investment in Harris Creek pays for itself in regional economic return in less than 2 years. And here's the number that puts the whole thing in perspective. The average cost of highway construction in Maryland runs about $6 million per mile. The state resurrected an entire estuarine engine, 348 acres of self-sustaining biological filtration that removes 1 million pounds of nitrogen per decade, supports 50-plus species, triples crab survival, and generates $23 million a year in economic activity, for roughly the cost of paving 5 miles of road. The project has now expanded to all 10 original tributaries, plus an 11th bonus site in Virginia. Over 2,400 acres of reef have been built, 7.5 billion oysters have been planted. And in the high-performing Virginia sites, the reefs are starting to sustain themselves without hatchery input. Wild larvae settling on the stone, building new layers, growing upward the way the system was designed to work for 6,000 years before anyone interrupted it. The bay bottom went from flat, dead mud to vertical living rock. Same water, same sediment load, same drainage basin, same diseases still present in the water column. The only variable that changed was height, 8 inches of granite, placed in the right location, protected from the dredge and loaded with biology, bred tough enough to survive. That was the entire intervention. The rest, the clear water, the grasses, the crabs, the oxygen, the nitrogen removal, the economic recovery, all of that was just the system doing what it was always designed to do once someone gave it back the one thing it had lost. The Chesapeake Bay wasn't broken by a catastrophe. It was broken by a subtraction. Someone removed the height from the bottom, and the physics of sedimentation did the rest. Yet every fix that tried to fight the mud by laying flat shell into it failed because it was working against the same physics that caused the problem. The fix that worked didn't fight the mud, it outbuilt it. 8 inches of stone, and the whole machine started running again. That's the lesson buried under 2,400 acres of granite at the bottom of the Chesapeake. The failure had a mechanical logic. Flat surfaces bury, buried surfaces can't recruit, and the loop runs downhill from there. The fix had the same logic running in reverse. Build a surface tall enough that the mud can't reach it, and 6,000 years of evolutionary engineering takes over and does the rest. If the way broken landscapes get rebuilt interests you, subscribe and I'll see you on the next one.